Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine put together by us here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find us online at virginiainstitute.org and on YouTube, search Freedom and Prosperity Radio for archived episodes of this program. Joining us to kick off this weekend's program is Todd Gathje. He's the Director of Government Relations for the Family Foundation. Todd, welcome back to Freedom and Prosperity Radio. How are you, sir?
Doing well. Thank you for having me back again.
I wish we had a less puzzling subject. We just saw a Newswire piece, I guess, during the past week. A couple of transgender students won an all-girls track meet. And even in places like Connecticut, parents are starting to cry foul over the issue of transgender, where the lines are, who decides where the lines are. And as you chronicle, the Virginia Department of Education has just decided, you know what, we're from the bureaucracy and we get to decide this stuff. Tell us what's going on in Richmond.
Yeah, it really is troubling here. So the Department of Education has issued some model guidelines or policies for local school divisions throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia to be able to adopt. This actually stems from legislation that was passed in 2020 that requires the Department of Education to develop these model guidelines to provide guidance on issues related to transgender students, how they identify, accommodations in the school. And so the Department of Education now has written up these guidelines without any input from professionals, clinicians, stakeholders who actually believe in the natural distinctions between the biological males and females. It was all one-sided, and these policies are very troubling, and they strike at the core of parental rights, bodily privacy, and free speech.
And I know that when the law passed last year, it was mainly to clarify, because we had some court cases regarding bathroom use and what was the limitations put on a school division regarding making restrooms available, that sort of thing. But you see the Pandora's box when you give the bureaucracy a blank check. They start filling it in. Now, they didn't ask anyone for any assistance. Did they get this just from their own reading online, or did they even talk to the school divisions? Certainly doesn't sound like they talked to any parents.
That's as far as the list is of those organizations that were included, Equality Virginia, Side by Side. Many of your organizations that are pro-LGBTQ and support that part of the community, they were all part of a long list of individuals that had input. But to our knowledge, there was no stakeholders that actually had some very strong disagreements with the direction of these policies. Let's be clear, we're not opposed to trying to put in place policies that protect students, that keep them from bullying and being harassed. Mm-hmm. But the problem with these policies is they stretch well beyond prevention of harm and crosses the line into sort of this mandatory promotion of viewpoints that are just impossible to implement. For example, they define gender identity as sort of this innate belief system within a student or within a person. It's their internal sense of their own identity, but it's subjective. Only they can determine that. More to the point is that it can also, by their definitions, be gender fluid. So that means they could be innate in that person to be gender fluid, which means they could transition from boy to girl at any moment, at any part of the day, and therefore have access to accommodations, to bathrooms, locker rooms, changing facilities, and no one will be able to challenge that because the guidelines also do not allow for teachers or administrators to ask for evidence, to ask for any type of documentation showing or proving this so-called transition has taken place, and it doesn't provide any sort of minimum duration of time. So these are going to be really difficult to implement. Just put yourself in the position of a teacher who is required under these guidelines to use certain speech, certain pronouns. Well, if they can change at any day whether or not they are a biological male or whether they believe that they're a male or a female, how difficult is that going to be for a teacher? And we've already seen in Virginia where one teacher, Peter Vlaming, lost his teaching job because he refused to be compelled to use certain pronouns. He worked with the student, came up with an agreement, but that was not good enough for that locality, for that school division. And I think we're going to see more of that as these policies are implemented.
That's what really makes that story tragic, Todd, is that the teacher went out of his way to address the needs, and it seemed like the student and the teacher found the best place to work. And isn't that the kind of thing we want our teachers to do? And not necessarily in the realm of transgender or certainly not limited to it, but in anything. If a student's falling behind and the teacher can help on a more personal level, that's what we want to encourage. We don't want to create this sort of turn on the laptop and watch the automaton recite some lesson plan and then make sure you scribble it all down, which it seems like this as a subtext is creating.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think we're finding, I guess, not just in the schools, but in everyday society, where we're getting away from this ability to have positive discourse, to be able to work out differences and different viewpoints in an agreeable way. We may disagree, but can we disagree agreeably? And more we're finding policies like these to be handed down that are going to be challenging for people really in the work environment and public settings to be able to have those disagreements, but be able to work through that and get along. These model policies are going to compel and mandate certain behaviors and actions that will really challenge those deeply, those fundamental abilities that we've had as a society to be able to work through those differences. I think if we look at these guidelines, we cannot underscore enough how much it targets parental rights. And I think your listeners should know that these guidelines, once they are implemented by the various local school divisions, will undermine parental authority. They essentially encourage teachers and administrators to not reveal to parents if a child is transitioning. Maybe they get to school and they're wearing different clothing. Maybe they're going by different pronouns. They are referring to themselves, if they are a biological male, they're referring to themselves as a female. The policies prevent the teachers, or would prevent the teachers and administrators from being able to have conversations with the parents about these changes. And wouldn't, as parents, we want to know if our children are going through those changes? Also, what if we have a child, a daughter, who is changing in the locker room? Shouldn't we know if there's a biological male also changing in that locker room with our daughter? This really targets the ability of parents to ensure that our children are safe and that they are being educated in the right way, and that they have privacy when they go into some of these facilities. These guidelines really strike at the core of parental authority and challenge our ability as parents to be able to make those important decisions to guide them, to nurture them, and to ensure their safety.
Todd Gathje is on with us. He's the Director of Government Relations at the Family Foundation, and you can find them online, familyfoundation.org. We're talking about some directives from the Department of Education providing guidance to schools regarding dealing with transgender. But something strikes me, Todd, and tell me if I'm wrong about this. But if we believe in the premise of adult responsibility to raise children, whether it be parental or step-parents, adoptive parents, that children under a certain age of majority are more susceptible to coercion, more susceptible to the whims of whimsy, more susceptible to peer pressure, more susceptible to so many things that adults grow less likely to fall prey to, that if you take the phrase transgender out of the story you told just before the break there and inserted sexual congress or religion or smoking or drinking or doing drugs, we'd be up in arms. We'd have the state police busting down the doors of such a place where young people under the age of majority are being, dealt with by strangers, non-family members, and ushered into lifestyles that they wouldn't have been in otherwise.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think we find ourselves in society where we are trying to give minors a lot of these powers and responsibilities that they are not prepared for, that they haven't developed, and they're not ready to embrace yet. And it's something that just happens through the maturation process. But more and more, the government seem to be trying to give more power to these students and to their children at the risk of undermining the parents and their ability to be able to guide them and make sure that they are on the right trajectory growing up. I think it's important that there's a give. If we go back to this issue, there's a growing body of scholarship that makes it very clear that the majority of children, they outgrow this gender dysphoria or confusion by the time they really reach puberty. So it's improper to impose these kind of policies that are going to really exasperate the challenges caused by gender confusion and ultimately cause more long-term damage to them while they're still trying to develop. The evidence is there, so it really is not incumbent upon the government to start imposing these mandatory policies when we have children that are still trying to figure things out. Middle school and high school are very difficult, and you're right, there's a lot of peer pressure. Policies like these that encourage and facilitate actions and behaviors that they're still trying to work through is really damaging and harmful to these children in the long term.
Well, and with the ramifications, I think about now here we are 25 years removed from the beginning of the Everybody Gets a Trophy agenda. Now we're seeing real-world issues with adults graduating college or getting to college and incapable of dealing with challenges, rejection, failure. Universities are crippled under the weight of trying to deal with students who have never been told that they failed a course before, and adults are going out. A huge industry has been built up of business consultants teaching human resources directors how to deal with these young people who have really never faced I'm sorry, you didn't win the game, and you don't get a trophy for this world that the adults have made and are there. And it was all under I think, the same guise of self-esteem. We don't want to crush their self-esteem. We want to boost their self-esteem. I remember it all, Todd. And it seems like this is doing the same thing. Are we doing another horrific social experiment with a generation of American kids that we're going to have to be dealing with in 25 years from now, where children are, in some cases, perhaps dealing with deep psychological problems?
Right. Yeah. That you sympathize for those parents that are struggling. They have a child that is going through something like this, and every bit of you wants to be sympathetic. You want to provide whatever resources you can to help them. At the same time, we don't just initiate all of these broad policies, like you said, that are going to just kind of change society in such a dramatic fashion, and that's the balance. We want to be sympathetic to those families that are dealing with this.
Oh yeah.
But at the same time, we can't impose policies on the rest of the society and the rest of the parents in this case who don't want to have their child placed in an awkward situation where they're having to change in front of someone of the opposite sex. This is not the approach to go.
Well, you use the double point score word right there, Todd. Resources. Where our schools should have resources. That's what when you and I were in school, I was still using stone knives and bear skins, but I presume you had ink pens by the time you got to school. You're younger than I am, but however it was, schools had guidance counselors. Schools had parent-teacher conferences. There was communication between teacher and parents, guidance counselors and parents, so that parents could have the access to resources that they might not have at home if their kids were having some sort or displaying some sort of issue at class. But we seem to have gone the other route, and we're looking for the issues rather than waiting for them to manifest or being aware of them when they do. Yeah,
that raises a good point. If we look at sort of society, and I'm going to use this phrase, this sexualization of society, where we have sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these things being thrown at our kids. My kids, I have kids in high school and middle school. They're being inundated with this, and it's also through the family life education. They're starting to learn about this. And it's, of course there's going to be students that struggle with this. And we used to have the ability to handle that. One resource was that you could go to a licensed counselor and help, if they're dealing with unwanted sexual desires, a counselor could help talk them through that.
Yeah.
Well, this past year, the General Assembly passed legislation that prohibits licensed counselors from doing that.
Amazing.
They'll lose their license if they help someone try and overcome these unwanted desires. At the same time, they could facilitate that. They can help them move along and embrace those desires. So we've gotten into a situation where this sexualization is being thrown at our kids. They're taking away resources or options for them to deal with it from a clinical standpoint. And then the next stage is really trying to undercut the parents and say if they don't agree with the child's preferred gender, then the next step is to accuse them of potential abuse. And that is certainly not what we want to have happening. We don't want our parents to be accused of abusing our children where all they're trying to do is parent them and nurture them and try and help them understand biological realities. But these guidelines would actually give teachers the ability to call in the local Department of Social Services if they thought or perceived, even if they thought there was just a hint of some type of abuse in this situation. This is very dangerous territory that we're getting into. So you can see where they're teaching it. They're now trying to co-opt them and kind of keep them entrapped in this sort of lifestyle, and then they want to come in and undermine the parents and even potentially charge them, with abuse or accuse them of that.
Todd, you bring up a great point. Todd Gathje is Director of Government Relations at the Family Foundation, where you talk about now, social services may be called in if a parent doesn't just accept what the school tells them their children want to be, and if they say, well, no, we'll work with them. And you think about the world we've developed where the government seems to be telling, not even implicitly anymore, explicitly, we know better how to raise your child than the parent does. How frightening has this become? And it's been societally, it feels like a blink of an eye since we started talking about, public school might be a little bit too much authority for government to have. And it's just, you woke up one morning and all of a sudden the school is more important than the parents.
Yeah, that is so true. It does seem like it's been in a blink of an eye. And for all of those who might be wondering, is that true? Well, in the draft policy, and I'll just read directly from it, it said that school staff should be prepared to support the safety and welfare of transgender students when their families are not affirming. And then it goes on to say, whenever school personnel suspects or becomes aware that a student is being accused or neglected, they shall only disclose to other school personnel with a legitimate educational interest. And then it goes on to say that they could then reach out to the local social services. So it is clearly setting it up so that these administrators can be able to report something that they just suspect is happening. And this is not the only case. Last year we saw a bill that would have added to our code section regarding child abuse and neglect any mental or physical abuse caused to a child based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. Of course, we understand, we agree, there should never be any abuse, whether it's verbal or physical.
Yep.
But it calls into question what is that verbal abuse? How is a government agency going to interpret that?
Absolutely.
And so that's where we stand. So you were right. We're starting to tread on very thin ice when it comes to parental authority, overstepping the ability of parents to make the wise decisions and the decisions that they know are good for their children.
And are there candidates? I mean, I know that we're still a long way away from Election Day in November, Todd, but I hope that there are candidates that are embracing some of this and are not fearful of the third rail that it could be, going towards the General Assembly election and the gubernatorial election as well.
Yeah, I think that there is a growing I guess distaste or concern. Maybe concern would be a better use of terms. A growing concern for this overreach, all of this effort to inject into our non-discrimination policies anything dealing with sexual orientation, gender identity, anything that is seeking to undermine parental authority, whether it's in the code or through the regulatory bodies. I think that there is a wide agreement among social conservatives that this is getting out of hand. Now, is that something that you can run on as a politician? I don't know. That's a good question, and I think as this session comes to a close, and these issues are out in front, and you have these school transgender policies. I'll remind the listeners that there were over 9,000 or 9,000 public comments that were made on these guidelines, and the majority of which were opposed to them. So the people of Virginia and families and parents understand what's happening, and I think it is important not just for politicians to hear this, but let me just reach out to churches as well, because you have families that are sitting in the pews and they're wondering, how do I handle this? I don't want to be ugly towards this other child, but I know what truth is. How do I handle this in a very respectful manner, but still live out our life according to our personal convictions? Those are going to be real conversations, and it's going to be even more important for the church to get involved in these cultural discussions, especially when it comes to specific policies like these transgender policies.
I think it is, and it is developing into what could very easily be a third rail societally, but the faith community has to be there for their parishioners, as they always have been, to hear them, to help them, because that's what's going to be needed. Talk about resources the Family Foundation makes available, Todd, that a listener could go online, say to familyfoundation.org, download some things. I hate to use the word talking points because this becomes such a political thing, but things that, strategies for parents or grandparents to talk to family members about.
Yeah, so certainly they can go to our website at familyfoundation.org. We have a lot of resources there for families. We have, of course, you can go and read our blogs. We post stuff about legislation. We also have a page for FLE, Family Life Education, where we list out all of the different parent portals and all of the different sites where you can look at the sex education curriculum. In addition to that, we have some alternatives to those. So if you elect to opt your child out of Family Life Education, we've posted some sites where you could go and access materials that would be more appropriate or that you would feel more appropriate in using. We also have, as you know, marijuana legalization is a huge issue this year. We have a marijuana page where families can go and learn about the dangers, if they're not already aware of them. We have a page there. We also have a site where you can go and look into signing up for our EQUIP training, our worldview training, or what we call EQUIP, and where you can, if you are in high school or in college, you can go and you can listen to key speakers come and touch on issues like marriage, religious liberty. It's a great opportunity, and now in this virtual environment, we have the capabilities here in our office to do it virtually. So if you're in Southwest Virginia and you hear about the EQUIP program, you can join virtually. So we have a lot of resources available for parents, and I'd encourage them to go to our website and peruse, and if they have any questions, feel free to call us. And in addition to that, if they are interested, we also have our Founding Freedoms Law Center. It's our legal arm that we just kicked off in July, focusing on primarily religious liberty issues. Our legal team is monitoring these transgender policies and are going to be looking at it from a very legal standpoint. And so if you have any legal questions, you can certainly reach out to them. Their site, their page is located on the Family Foundation webpage as well.
Well, thank you for all of that, Todd, but especially your counsel on this issue. I would remind people the worst thing that compounds this stuff amongst families is silence. So being bold and being able to have these conversations is so important to the survival of a family. Thank you so much for your visit this week on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.
Thank you so much.
Coming up next, Chris Edwards, Director of the Tax Policy at the Cato Institute, on the $15 minimum wage on Freedom and Prosperity Radio.